Hello, I'm AustinMin. My GitHub is AustinMin00 and my EDX is AustinMin105. Today is May 15th, 2026, and I will be discussing the data breach against Vercel that occurred on April 19th, 2026. As the breach didn't compromise infrastructure, there won't be a CVE number in this presentation, and today we will be examining the evidence that highlights modern security concerns with malware, code injection, session hijacking, and others adjacent to this breach. Before detailing the situation, I'd like to give a brief intro to the parties involved. First, we have Vercel, a cloud application company that maintains Next.js web development frameworks. Then we also have Context, a third-party application that uses AI tools in assisting developers and teams to handle their workspace data. This tool specifically requires some form of permissions to your systems in order to operate. And then finally, we have Google Workspace, which will only get mentioned as they were not affected, but are a component of the breach. As you can see, we have a rough timeline of the breach from start to end in a 3-month period. Notice that February and March are 1, as there was no substantial data that could support my investigation in March alone. However, we can assume that the attacker operated through these months. So let's have a look around February, where there was an endpoint compromise with the malware called a Luma Stealer. This Luma Stealer gives the attacker the ability to steal a Vercel employee's personal Google Workspace account, which they do successfully. And specifically, we can consider this a session hijacking of the workspace's OAuth session. And upon this impersonation of that session, trust expanded outwards to the employee's Vercel account to the company's main database itself, in which the attacker then pivots into their internal systems and successfully enumerates the data and exfiltrates it to their own database. And this is all in the attempts to monetize the data. Come April, Vercel becomes aware of this unauthorized access to their internal system and reviews the logs, which does identify that the root cause was a compromised Google Workspace indeed, and it was involving the software Context AI. Vercel then pivots themselves and engages with the appropriate cybersecurity authorities to investigate and gain the full gauge of the scope of the incident. We are told that the sensitive data was not compromised as they were encrypted at rest. However, non-sensitive data was stolen. Vercel advises their users to rotate their tokens and investigate their logs for any further suspicious activity, and specifically emphasis on token rotation, as deletion alone will not affect the compromised tokens that are linked to your environments. They can still operate in them. The last action that was taken outside of remedies for the breach is a collaboration between maintainers, which includes Vercel's, to review npm package integrity. And the verdict was that they are safe. However, as of today, if you are aware or kept up with the news, we know that a lot of our npm packages right now are a bit compromised, so you should still be careful. As you know, outside of this breach, there is some other things going on. It's been a very rough year for cybersecurity. This breach highlights several core themes that we can go over, starting with endpoint compromises, particularly the Luma Stealer malware, which infects systems via command injection, in this case through a Roblox AutoFarm download which contained the malware. This works without privilege escalation and a zero-day exploit, a vulnerability that essentially undermines any cloud security that we have and is where most modern compromises will start, at the endpoint. We also see identity and session abuse, where MFA and SSO, whilst are secure, are kind of rendered useless in the sense as they can be bypassed with the stolen post-authentication artifact or secrets. Upon this impersonation, you can also notice an OAuth trust expansion because of this stolen authentication, where the compromised endpoint affects systems connected on the downstream. Notably, SaaS products, which introduce a really, really big risk to your ecosystem overall, where any tools or systems connected or that trust the same identity provider, like a Google Workspace, will amplify the blast radius of the breach. Things like your drives, emails, ticketing systems may all be considered compromised and should be treated as such if you are relevant to the breach or part of the system. We also have some least privilege failures, where standard IAMs, like in AWS, are treated with more rigor than any SaaS OAuth scopes. In this context, the oversight with the employee using a third-party tool with broad permissions caused a lapse in Vercel's security overall. And in other words, a lot of times SaaS tools can often exceed their operational necessity for a company, granting a hidden privilege layer to our sensitive data. This attributes to detection difficulty, where malicious actors may take advantage of the flaws that were just mentioned. CTO at Nudge Security, Jamie Blasco, states that this is a common pattern in breaches and has been for the past 15 years, mainly to point out that AI is just assisting in these attacks that we're seeing. Attackers will take advantage of small organizations with immature securities in order to slip through other systems undetected. Along with that, the malware alone is very sophisticated as they use obfuscation to bypass security systems and hinder the decompilement of them. Now we can view the issue with data classification, as we know that being online, it leaves a fingerprint of your digital identity, and that includes the habits that come with you. And the data that we don't protect is vulnerable to this very use case. Vercel sensitive data being encrypted was good, but non-sensitive data that could hold this valuable information was not. And the malicious actor can find that value in the form of any operational metadata. And this kind of fosters things like social engineering techniques or potentially revealing a hole in the system's infrastructure. Then finally, we can address that, what I believe is the most difficult to overcome is being response latency, where 2 months had gone by before any real implementation or remedy was offered. And that's mainly due because there's a proximity visibility gap between organizations. There's also the time it takes to unveil the unauthorized users that had the stolen authentication, where only suspicious activity would be a reliable giveaway. However, we know that these attackers are very clever and they're going to use methods to remain hidden. Especially now with AI being involved and being the powerful tool that it is, these malicious practices are only expedited and increases latency further. Now, there was a lot covered in those last two slides, but it really does boil down to 3 points of prevention. We have endpoint and identity security, OAuth governance, and the blast radius reduction. So for the first point, we can focus mainly on the endpoints themselves, as we know that penetrating cloud infrastructures can take more time and resources than simply infecting the endpoint itself. Measures can be taken by restricting unauthorized software, browser extensions, or the installation of them, is what I mean. We can enforce policies for managed devices from accessing the sensitive systems, hardening our monitoring to suspicious activity and traffic, and then finally just training employees on better practices to combat malware and session theft. When we look at OAuth Gov, what we're looking at is just reviewing our upper level management practices. Like SaaS applications should be flagged for review before being implemented for its permission scopes. We can maintain an allow list of approved OAuth applications, and we could also block and restrict high-risk integrations as a default from the start. And then lastly, we should offer more attention to how we handle our data, where the game is really just reduction. We could definitely separate our secrets from operational metadata. We could encrypt our sensitive values both at rest and in transit. We could restrict admin privileges to only essential personnel, or even segment access between teams, projects, and their environments. And even though we have all these prevention points, there's still a lot of room for improvement, and there are a lot of points that I didn't bring up. So everything that I'm presenting here is superficial, but I do believe it carries the essence of knowing that we do have a lot of measures and options to take in order to improve upon our security systems. But they really should be made within the bounds of what we can afford, because there are many things that do require a high level of skill or a lot of funds to maintain. I would like to thank the sources displayed here for giving me the information I needed for my investigation. I definitely feel like I got a really proper understanding of the structure of this breach, as well as the tools that assisted it, and I hope that you were able to absorb my perception of that information. And I would like to just say thank you for taking the time to listen, and I hope that you have a great day.